Hi, I'm Rodi Srivastava,
I'm Anuradha Nagraj.
and this is The Migration Story.
In a welcome relief for millions of migrant workers, Saudi Arabia has officially ended the kafala system, giving them more rights and freedom to work in the kingdom.
After decades of criticism, the country has officially abolished its kafala, or sponsorship.
Saudi Arabia has successfully abolished its decades-old kafala system.
सऊदी कफाला सिस्टम बिल्कुल खत्म हो गया है। अब जितने भी लोग सऊदी में काम
Recently, our news was flooded with reports celebrating Saudi Arabia's apparent abolishment of the kafala system. If true, this would be massive news for South Asians, who comprise the bulk of Saudi's low-wage workforce. As per official estimates, of India's 15 million migrants overseas, over 9 million live in the Arab Gulf and 2.7 million in Saudi alone. Join us in today's episode, where we speak with expert Vani Saraswathi from Mirrors about why we should be very cautious about this news of Saudi abolishing kafala. Even more important, perhaps, as Saudi is the next host of the 2034 FIFA World Cup. So, hello, Vani. Thank you so much for being with us today at the Migration Story. For our listeners, we have with us today the editorial director at Mirrors, which is a GCC-based research and advocacy organization. So, Vani, a very, very warm welcome to you.
Thanks for having me, Namrata.
So, Vani, perhaps we can start off talking a little bit about your work. I mean, of course, I've known you for a long time now, but perhaps you could introduce yourself and your organization. Tell us about your work.
Sure. So I am currently based in India after a very long stint in the Gulf, in Qatar, but my work continues to be there. I used to be a mainstream journalist who moved over to advocacy research. Mirrors, formerly known as migrantrights.org, is probably one of its kind advocacy and research portal in the Gulf. It's a bilingual platform. Mirror stands for Migrant Rights Research Open Repository. And what we basically do is we fill the vacuum, the gap in both free media and open and vibrant civil society in the Gulf. As you may be aware, both of these are highly censored, highly controlled.
Thanks for that, Vani. So perhaps we could start off with unpacking this term kafala, because we bandy about this term so much. What does this kafala mean? How does it apply to the labor market? And very specifically today, we're going to talk about Saudi. So what does it mean for Saudi specifically?
So kafala, there's a lot of academic discourse around the origins of kafala, how it started when the Gulf countries were British protectorate. But basically, kafala means a way in which you sponsor a guest. And now that stands for the sponsorship system, which is for you to live and work in the Gulf. And if you're not a citizen, you need to have a sponsor, and that sponsor is usually your employer. And if you're a dependent, that sponsor is usually your spouse or a parent. So they are your kafil. This is the system. Now, the kafala isn't really one law. It's not just the immigration law or just the labor law. It's a governance complex. It has codified practices, but there are also customary laws. There are also practices that can't be seen in black and white in any law, but is just accepted as the norm. And then there are practices that feed to strengthen the kafala. So, to keep it very simple, when we say the kafala system, the most important and the most binding part of the kafala system is that the residence visa and the work visa is tied to the same employer. So if you lose your job, you lose your right to live there almost immediately. And this means you put more controls on the worker. There's more pressure on the worker to be subservient, to kind of put up with a lot of exploitation, because to question that would mean to be fired, to lose their job, and then lose their residence. Now, the reason that this needs to be kept in mind when we talk about kafala being abolished is just renaming the system. So we've been hearing it a lot. We heard it in the Qatar context. We're hearing it in the Saudi context of how these countries have replaced the sponsorship or kafala system with a contractual system. But the contract still has the same principles, right? Where your residence permit is tied to your employer, to your work visa. And you do not have the agency to renew your residence visa by yourself. That can only be done by your employer. So that's where the control lies. And why this is significant to keep in mind is wages are very low, right? Across the Gulf, wages for lower income migrant workers, particularly those coming from Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Africa, are extremely low. There's a discriminatory wage system. And this is not a living wage. Even in a country like Qatar that has a minimum wage, which they call a non-discriminatory minimum wage, it is not a living wage. It's really too low. And why we connect the wages to any changes in the kafala system is it does not matter what you call it, you're still dependent on your employer as a low income worker for your very sustenance. Where you live, what you eat, how much you commute within the country, everything is controlled by the employer, by the kafil.
So, Vani, if I can also ask you a little bit to go a little bit deeper into this type of dependence. Supposing I get a better job offer from someone else, like how does it work in practice if I want to switch jobs?
So, in most countries, they have loosened this, but earlier you had to receive a no objection certificate, an NOC, from your current employer slash kafil in order to change jobs. You could not change jobs otherwise. Different countries have changed the process. Saudi also claims to have changed the process, but there is a process still in place. You still need to get that permission in some manner, right? It may not be called an NOC, but you can't just kind of give a notice, your resignation, and a month later go and join a new employer. It's not that simple. Because at every step, you're not only transferring your work contract, you're also transferring your immigration status from one sponsor to the other. So that's where all of the control lies. Now, that control could be in terms of just being very vindictive and not allowing someone to change jobs, but that control could also be demanding money for them to change jobs. And we have seen this in different instances across the Gulf. So for you to have the job mobility means you're either investing your money or, it's the cases of an employer just allowing this to carry on in a smooth manner is not as common as one would expect, especially in the early phases of reforms. And that is where Saudi is still at. Yes, it is saying that you can leave the country, so it's not just about changing jobs. Even when you want to exit the country, you need an exit visa, right? These are things that are being loosened. They haven't been completely abolished. They exist in a certain manner. And so, in this context, to say kafala is being abolished or has been abolished is actually untrue because that controls are still in place. So it's not just about changing jobs or leaving the country. It's about applying for a bank account. It's about applying for a bank loan for your car. At every step, you need your sponsor slash employer's permission or a letter to do that. They have so much control over your day-to-day living.
Yeah, and that sounds quite problematic because one of the things in the world of labor that anyway everyone is always trying to counter is the imbalance of power between the employer and workers. And I can imagine that this must be exacerbated manyfold in the context that you're describing, where it's an employer-tied visa sponsorship system. So I was going to ask you, Vani, you mentioned this now about quote unquote kafala being abolished. So we just saw recently that there were this information which seems to have turned out to be misinformation being peddled that Saudi had abolished the kafala system. So could you just give us some thoughts on it and a little bit of context as well?
Yeah. So the Zero report or the first report on this came out on October 18th, if I'm not mistaken. from a UK-based NGO that made this claim, quoting three figures in it, two of whom are no longer in the position, haven't been in that position for years. So they basically recycled quotes from previous interviews regarding Qatar and used it to say they were talking about Saudi abolishing the kafala system. The third quote is from a well-known Gulf researcher who has, we spoke to him and he says he didn't have any communication with them. And that quote that they attributed to him was again a quote taken out of context from a report that appeared years ago with regard to the Qatar reforms. So this was the first report. And then the Indian media picks it up around 21st or 22nd of October and they run with it without any kind of fact checking. Now, keep in mind two figures named. One is the previous head of ITUC, and another is a senior official of ILO. It was just a simple Google search to find out that they're no longer in those positions. Even that level of fact checking wasn't done. And they just ran with it. And then everybody else picked it up. And today I saw the UN Special Rapporteur on Slavery was commending Qatar on, Saudi on abolishing the kafala system. So there doesn't seem to be any kind of fact checking that has taken place. And Saudi also seems to have taken no effort to explain anything because it serves their agenda. We don't know who was behind the misinformation or disinformation, but the ones that could clarify it have been rather quiet. Of course, many society, organizations have spoken up and said that this isn't true. Now, another reason that we need to be cautious of these claims being made is the false sense of security it gives both the migrant workers and governments of sending countries that, the problem is fixed. And I think one of the reasons that this whole thing has taken on a life of its own is Saudi is one of the largest receiving countries of migrant labor for many Asian countries. It has, I think, the largest number of Bangladeshis living abroad. It has a couple of million Indians living there as well. So it is a country that's really important to these sending countries, right? But there's also a complete lack of understanding of what the kafala is. And I think to a large degree, NGOs need to probably take responsibility for that, for this lack of understanding. Because when the campaign against kafala began about a decade or so ago or before, the whole thing was abolish kafala without really understanding that it isn't one unit that can just be abolished or replaced. Right? There are so many intersecting laws across so many jurisdictions: Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Home Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Labor. So it's not just one unit that could just be abolished or replaced. So I think that kind of has set the tone over the years, the lack of understanding itself of what the kafala system is. The really interesting discussion around it has been in academia, and that's not something that's accessible to everybody.
Yeah, which is why I'm so glad you agreed to have this chat with me as well. And thank you for shedding light on that, because from what I had surmised as well, there hadn't been any official statement from any Saudi authorities about abolishing kafala. So I think what you described raises so many different concerns. One is about the spread of information, dearth of fact checking practices, so all of those things. And then the knock on effects it could also have, exactly as you said, for aspiring migrant workers.
We also spoke with Mr. Manda Bhim Reddy, Vice Chairman of the NRI Advisory Committee of the Government of Telangana. Here's what he had to say.
I spoke with the Indian migrant workers from Telangana who are presently living in Saudi Arabia. There was no official statement from their side about abolishing kafala. Over time, there has been some softening of the laws, but kafala is not abolished as such. For low-wage workers, it does not matter if there is any announcement on kafala or no kafala. They discuss it among themselves, but in the end, they will still go for work because they need this work. In Saudi, there are two important words for us to know when it comes to workers. Hurub is a term from Saudi Arabia that refers to a worker being reported as a runaway or absconded by their sponsor. The another word is matloob, is referred to a worker declared wanted by authorities for a crime or outstanding issues like loans and fines in Saudi Arabia. The status of hurub and matloob has serious legal consequences for the employees, including fines, jail term, deportation, and a potential ban from re-entering the country. It is a serious issue for expatriate workers in Saudi Arabia. These cases are very common even now, and we can see it in workers in Telangana.
There exists this city built by labor, mostly men, who disappear after their respective buildings are made. Once the last brick is laid, the glass spotless, the elevators functional, the plumbing operational, the laborers, every single one of them, begin to fade before disappearing completely. Some believe the men become ghosts, haunting the facades they helped build. An excerpt from the novel Temporary People by Deepak Unikrishnan.
You have lived in the Gulf for so long yourself. What are the kind of things that you've seen in terms of the type of issues workers have faced in Gulf countries, including in Saudi?
So Saudi is actually really unique in many ways because the way the kafala system looks in Saudi is actually different from how it looks in other Gulf countries as well. For one, the size of the country, and also that labor, there are also citizens in these positions, right? Say in a country like Qatar or UAE, you do not have citizens competing for a lot of the jobs that migrants do, just given the hierarchies. Whereas in Saudi, it's a mixed economy. You have very rich Saudis, you have poor Saudis, you have Saudis who need jobs at every level. So the labor market itself looks very different from many of the other countries. Probably Bahrain and Oman, not so much. Very different from Kuwait, UAE, and Qatar. So this is the labor market. So the labor law has a different application within Saudi. Now, the immigration looks different as well. And one thing that we need to keep in mind is a very intrinsic part of how the kafala system thrives is the recruitment practices. You make sure that controls are in place even before they land in the country they're working in. And Saudi, for all its big projects, has this whole concept of mega recruiters. So it's very, very difficult for a company to directly recruit anybody, especially in construction, especially in the low-income jobs. You have to go through these mega recruiters. So the mega recruiter then becomes the first kafil. So the degrees of separation between an employer and the worker are more than in other countries. And then the degrees of separation between the migrant resident, the rights holder, and the government are also more in a place like Saudi because you have layers of employment. So it can get very, very difficult to crack down the chain of responsibility. So this is quite different in Saudi. It's easier probably in other countries. Also the size of the country. You might have a certain experience if you're in Riyadh and Dammam and Jeddah versus if you're in one of the more remote or rural areas of Saudi, which also has a thriving economy and a huge dependency for migrant workers. And especially in the so-called domestic work sector, which we can touch upon in a bit. So in a place like Saudi, if you look at it, this whole practice of public-private partnership, even in access to justice, is being strengthened. So if you have a problem, you're not immediately going directly to the government or the labor department. What you're doing is you're going to an agent, a typing center. So if you go to the Ministry of Human Resources in Riyadh, right across the road, you'll see all of these tiny kiosks, the typing centers or the electronic centers, which will be the first step towards filing a complaint. For instance, it's similar in the UAE as well. So from the very beginning, the idea is to make sure the worker to access any of their rights, any of their benefits, is first, you tire them out to the process. That's how you put it. You place so many obstacles, they're going to give up at some point. If they're not paid, they might fight for a month, 2 months. But remember, the wages are so low, but the cost of living is high. It just doesn't make sense for them to stay back and fight. Either they become homeless and destitute, or they have to work irregularly, which puts them at greater risk under the law. So they just give up and go home. And the reason that it becomes difficult to fight your sponsor is the sponsor is the one who's giving you your accommodation and food. And if you file a complaint against them, chances of you being evicted from your accommodation are very, very high. So all of these interconnections make it difficult for workers to really speak up. And then, of course, the lack of civil society, lack of unions, which is a huge issue. You can't have such a large labor force and disallow unions, migrants to be part of unions. There are no sectoral unions, there are no company-wide unions. And there are 3 countries in the Gulf that have unions: Kuwait, Oman, and Bahrain. But do they speak for the interests of migrant workers? No. And in Saudi, absolutely not. So you don't even have that. You don't have the power for negotiation or collective bargaining either in these contexts. So there are, at every step of or at every point of your residence and work, your rights are being stripped away slowly. You're made to constantly feel like the other, right? You're not integrated enough into the system to understand how you can navigate and claim your rights.
That makes a lot of sense. And I was just thinking it's one of those odd things, right? Like, as someone who grew up in the Gulf myself, though in Oman, I think it's one of those interesting things where, of course, in my context, as a much more privileged migrant than, say, someone who's emigrating for construction work and has to work for many hours also in blistering temperatures, I think that it's that very strange thing where in some ways you are perhaps culturally closer as well, but at the end of the day, the nature of this quote unquote kafala system, which, as you said, differs though from country to country, but in principle there is this overarching sense that migrant workers are still not the same as nationals, that leaves you kind of at the margins. You're sort of out of, like, even if people wanted to integrate, I don't think that they would necessarily sort of be able to, which is, a sad part of the problem.
Listeners, do stay tuned. We'll be back after this short break.
तो आप लोग कहाँ से आए हैं यहाँ पे? बनारस से।
ना वेलोर साइड इल्ले और वसूर उड़ीसा से। सुबह 6 बजे उठना है, 6 बजे 7 बजे काम करा जाता है। कभी रात को 9 बजे तक काम करते हैं, 8-10 घंटे हो जाएगा। 10 घंटे से ऊपर होता है। ஒரு நாளைக்கு 2 ஒரு படம் 1.5 படம் ஓட்டுங்க. கரண்ட் இருந்தால் 1.5 ஓடும், கரண்ட் இல்லைன்னா ஒரு படம் வரும். ஒரு படகுக்கு வந்து 240 ரூபா 250 ரூபா. ஒரு நாளைக்கு மொத்தமாக வந்து ஒரு 500 ரூபா 600 ரூபா. கரண்ட் இருந்தால் ஒரு 600 ரூபா சம்பாதிக்கலாம், இல்லைன்னா மினிமம் ஒரு 500 ரூபா, அவ்வளோதான்.
Watch the video story Inside Bengaluru's Power Looms, Migrant Lives Running on Shifts and Dust, only on the migrationstory.com.
On domestic workers, Saudi, what we need to keep in mind is, though domestic work globally is feminized, in Saudi, the majority of domestic workers are male. And though there was an expectation when women were allowed to drive, this would change, it didn't. And there are a couple of reasons for it. So the male domestic workers could be drivers, gardeners, cooks. But Saudi recently expanded its categories of domestic work, and this is hugely problematic. We did mention, the labor reform initiative, the LRI, as Saudi calls it. It excludes domestic workers from most of these changes, reforms. But domestic workers, as far as Saudi is concerned, are not just those working in the household. You look at the categories, it includes nursing adjacent jobs, it includes special education, it includes farming and agriculture and tailoring, So what they've basically done is they've made it easier for citizens or sponsors with smaller businesses to recruit workers as domestic workers without needing to fulfill the nitakat quota, which is the Saudiization quota, to make sure that all the articles of the labor law applies to them as well. So it's kind of a very smart, very strategic move in the way they've expanded the domestic work categories to include 13 different skills or, professions. But the living conditions of domestic workers continues to be pretty precarious, especially women living in the households. Because there, the kafil, the employer, has absolute control, like more than in a private sector company. They have absolute control over their female employees, not just because of the law, also because of cultural practices. It's a kind of control they would have over female members of their families as well.
And
I'll
just to
stop here
clarify,
because I just don't want to wander off too much. So I'll just pause
no,
here.
no, no, that's very useful to know, Vani, and it's very sort of good comprehensive context that you've given us. I also was going to clarify a couple of things for the listeners. So the first is that on the domestic sort of who is a domestic worker issue, because even according to the ILO, like for instance, someone who is a driver, essentially everyone who works within an ambit of a household doing certain things which are attributed to the house are domestic workers. But what you're saying is what becomes problematic here is that they completely fall outside the law and legal protections. And now
Of the
they
labor
have,
law.
exactly. And now they have, so if I understood correctly, that's what you're saying, right? Like, and now they have so many more categories of workers who essentially fall outside the labor law.
Fall only under the domestic worker law of Saudi. Saudi does have a domestic worker law. So they're only
Okay.
governed by that.
Okay, so do they have a minimum wage, for example, then?
No, they have no minimum wage. Any minimum wage that may apply is what's decided bilaterally. So whatever's on India's e-migrate, for instance. But these are just suggestions, right? It can't be really enforced because it's not Saudi's minimum wage.
Exactly. And it's what we call a referral wage, if I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken.
Yeah.
So the first is, how did this start? I mean, when did, for instance, a lot of Indian workers, people from South Asia, when did they start migrating? I think it would be great to hear about this. And you use this word Saudiization, if you can talk about those two things.
So all of these countries have nationalization schemes. So they want to make sure that their citizens, that the priority is given to their citizens to fill any labor market need. And that only if they can't find a citizen can you then recruit someone from abroad. And the reason that these quotas are put in place is very often it's cheaper to bring people from abroad, right? It's cheaper to just say get an accountant or a cashier from another country. You want an Arabic speaking teacher, bring someone from Egypt, things like this. Then hire someone locally because they might be not just more expensive, you have to pay them more, but also because you won't have as much control over them. So this is also the truth that the employer may not have control. So these job nationalization schemes are there all over the Gulf. So it's either Emiratization or Qatarization. In Saudi's case, it's called the Nitakat system. So the Saudi nationalization scheme is called Nitakat system. And a lot of the company's government paperwork is dependent on you meeting that Nitakat quota. And different sectors from retail, hospitality, management, whatever, oil and gas, different sectors have different levels of Saudiization needs. So this is what the Nitakat system is. It's to make sure that the job needs of citizens are met before you recruit people from abroad. Now, Saudi has other ways in which it dissuades people from recruiting labor from abroad. One is a dependence tax, where you pay a certain amount for every dependent you have. So even if a highly paid executive, I go to Saudi, I want to bring my family in, I'm going to pay extra for them. So these are ways in which you make it more expensive for you to live with your family there, more expensive for a company to recruit a foreigner, and trying to make it more appealing to recruit locally. And I must say, in many sectors, Saudi has trained its citizens well. be it in hospitality or retail. You do see them in all of these sectors, and they are being trained to take over those jobs. That's not a contentious issue at all. But the problem is when you want to do that, but you also want to make sure that your citizens get away with cheap labor. And so you kind of expand your categories of domestic work. You make it easier for them to recruit outside of the labor law. That is the problem. The problem is that you want to meet those quotas, but you also want to make it simpler for your citizens to have easy access to exploitative labor.
Exactly. And this actually links to the point I think that you were raising earlier, right? Which is that the nature or the kind of nodes between the worker and their direct employer are actually quite a few often. And so even doing something like filing a complaint, it's like the process itself is punishment, right? It sounds like that. And exactly as you said, that these types of things make it sort of easier to keep wages depressed and your workforce exploitable, whoever's coming in from overseas, especially migrant workers from emerging markets. But
I would in fact say, they keep the wages depressed to enable everything else. See, the minute you have some economic independence, then you have the confidence to question things. You control how much money someone has, how dependent they are on the employer, then everything else becomes easy. They can change everything. They can, in fact, actually get rid of the kafala system if they want. But if they make sure that there's no minimum living wage, they will ensure that the worker is completely dependent on the employer.
Yes, and I'm sure they benefit economically from that.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So that sort of makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, obviously not that I'm saying that it is at all acceptable, but I can see, unfortunately, the very deeply problematic economic logic behind that. I was going to ask actually, so what you were describing in this Nitakat system, their Saudiization policy, is essentially like a system of quotas where one sector or one type of organization you can hire, I don't know, X number of migrant workers. It can be in a company of 100, maybe 10 migrant workers. In some cases, none, depending on the job. So I've heard from a lot of different colleagues in different Gulf countries that there is often now some degree to which they're trying to police that also and regulate that. So, for instance, there'll be people working in offices, but if their visa specifies the wrong job description and they're in the office, they could actually get, like reprimanded for that and apprehended for that and then taken in. So, this is what I've heard of this kind of like sweeps of offices and all of that. Is this something that you've heard still continues in different countries, including in Saudi, but just for some context on how these things work in different Gulf countries?
I don't know about the sweeps that are done. I'm not very sure about it. But there are other ways in which they monitor it, right? It takes Saudi's case itself. The reason that a lot of the large companies will not do direct recruitment is not just because it's difficult, it's also because they can't meet the Nitakat quota. So they'd rather go to a mega recruiter and do the subcontracting. And the mega recruiter then will have like a huge variety of visa categories that they hold, different nationalities, different professions. But all of that is now being linked to skilling. So this is their justification to ensure that there is no mismatch of visa and job done. Saudis made skill certification mandatory. So this is called the Takamol system. And there are, I think, nearly 40 categories, but I need to verify, like 40 categories of work. Welding, car mechanic, AC mechanic, whatever. You have to go through the Takamol testing before you even get your visa. And you can then come in on that category of visa to do that work. So this is their reasoning as well, not only to make sure you get workers who are qualified to do that job, you make sure the workers coming for the job that was promised. So this is the reason that they do the skill thing. Now, the problem with it is this skilling is done. The burden, the financial burden of that is on the individual migrant and the sending country. They bear the cost. So be it in India, it's part of the Indian skilling program in Bangladesh. So Saudi is not taking responsibility for it. They're only saying we need workers who are skilled, who are certified, But it doesn't mean that they're going to pay them better or pay them even a promised wage, minimum wage. But they've still put this demand to make sure that this, and the way the testing is done is actually there's a camera, and apparently someone in Saudi is watching you being tested. There's a camera and there's a little kiosk, and you're being tested for it wherever you are. So this is how they're trying to, kind of make sure that there's no mismatch of jobs, right? Whether they're actually doing raids of these organizations, I'm not sure, because they're not even allowing the workers to come in without the certification.
Okay, very interesting. That is definitely, I think, an evolution a little bit in some of the practices I've heard of before. But now I think, Vani, we've covered a lot of ground. I just had one or two, like maybe lighter questions, because obviously, like, this is a difficult subject in a really fraught context. Obviously, migrant workers still go there because they, someone is in need of a job. They hope that even that whatever 10, 20 reals that they're earning in extra that they would have earned in their home country, wherever, or home state here in India, that's why also workers are going. But at the end of the day, obviously, they often also face difficulties overseas, especially in the Gulf and places like Saudi, depending on what job they're going for also, of course. I wanted to ask you on a much lighter note. I don't know if there are any movies or films that you've watched that, you felt, wow, this really actually captures something of the migrant experience.
Yeah. This movie that everybody talks about, Goat Life, Aata Jeevitham, I'm not a fan of the movie, but the book is brilliant by Benjamin. And the reason that book I would suggest people read is those are cases we almost receive on a weekly basis even now. Another movie that I really loved watching, it's more on domestic workers, the dynamics of having a female domestic worker at home, is this Pakistani film called Pinky Mem Sahib. It's about this young woman who comes from Pakistan to work for a Pakistani family in Dubai. What happens to her? It touches upon a lot of social issues. It touches upon life in Dubai. It'll make you laugh, but it'll also make you think. It doesn't whitewash any of the issues either. And then there is another film that was made during the pandemic. It's a Malayalam film called See You Soon. There is another film called Ilo Ilo, if I'm not mistaken. It's not about the Gulf, but it could be about the Gulf. It's about a Filipino worker working in Singapore. And that whole dynamic of taking care of someone else's child when your child is back home waiting for you to call. I would suggest some of these things.
Thank you so much for all of this. I think you've raised so much sort of food for thought. I suppose if we were to kind of close up this conversation also where we started about this piece of misinformation that went around about Saudi abolishing kafala, what, if you had any thoughts about what viewers can do, or listeners can do, or I mean, it could be businesses, it could be different stakeholders, right? Like who could be listening. What are your thoughts on what we should be doing as a country from where a lot of migrants go to Saudi, but a lot of other Gulf countries as well? What would some of your suggestions be?
So I would say the minute someone uses kafala as a catch-all phrase, disbelieve it. Just to ask the question what they mean by kafala. Because as I said, kafala is being used as a catch-all phrase for everything to do with the Arab world. It's in fact taken on rather racist and Islamophobic connotations as well. So just keep in mind that kafala is not one law, it's not one set of laws, it's an entire system. So when someone says kafala is being abolished, question that. In terms of misinformation, I think we are in a very, very scary phase of how news is being generated and how news is communicated. If you looked at the original report, the names that they mentioned, they quoted names that were well-known people in this particular field. And only one of them has come out publicly and said, this is not me, I never said this. And then the media runs with it. The top Indian media ran with it. So really, we have to be very fearful of any kind of information that comes out and really do some due diligence. Now, are people really interested in it? Then I would say, like, if you are planning to go to Saudi or to the Gulf, read your contract, read the terms of your contract, speak to the community before you take And I'm not talking about only lower income workers. We've seen even executives, skilled workers landing in a lot of trouble because they haven't realized the system that they were getting into. So going well prepared is important and asking the right questions. Yeah, but I really have no answer on how to counter misinformation because I think everybody is struggling with it.
Yeah, it's just such a sea, right? It's very difficult. I mean, I think that what you were describing, which is basic awareness and questioning, is this legitimate information, would be a wonderful place to start. And of course, fact checking, like you alluded to earlier, and all of that, because it is very problematic if they have also quoted a bunch of people who have never spoken to the organization who put out this report in the first place. So, anyway, but Vani, thank you so much. This has been such an informative conversation. And of course,
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. We'll all keep track of your work and all the best.
Yeah, thank you so much, Namrata. Good luck to you.
Thank you.
I was astonished by the sudden surge of loneliness and terror I felt when I realized how stranded I was in this hostile place, that I did not know how to speak to people and win them over to me, that the bank, the canteen, the supermarket, the dark streets seemed so intimidating, and that I could not return from where I came, that, as I then thought, I had lost everything. A quote from the book Admiring Silence by Abdul Razak Gurna.
Check out our website www.themigrationstory.com for more content. You can subscribe to our podcast on YouTube and Spotify. The audio editing and sound design is by Akshay Ramuhalli. Stay tuned for more stories on migration.
The Migration Story.